acted against anti-Converso discrimination. But in fact, El Relator was underscoring not only a sense of pride of Paul himself, but he's underscoring, I think, a problem, a real theological, political problem in Paul himself.
Yeah, and that goes back to, well, later we see the split, or earlier we see the split in the early church, the Jerusalem church, between James and the others. Paul, of course, was the representative of, like, say, the Gentile faction, and I guess James would be the Jewish Christian faction that wanted this only for the Jews, right?
Yeah, Peter especially, yes, of course.
Peter, and so in a way, this tension exists and kind of survives much longer than we thought. No? Would you agree with that? The split. It doesn't end with Paul or with
No, it doesn't end at all. Well, according to Paula Fredriksen, she's one of the leading scholars on early Christianity. We have to wait for at least 400 years.
400 years before there's some kind of resolution.
Yeah, it completely disappeared because you have different currents, named sects of Jewish Christian believers, like the Ebionites, like others.
Right.
And they have to confront other views. But the view of Paul, if I may say, through what today we know and how today we interpret Paul, it's not an anti-Jewish pro-Gentile way of being Christ believer. Paul somehow he tried to negotiate between the two. The Paul we know today, thanks to different scholars, including Boyarin and Fredriksen and Sanders and others, Paul was more dialectical in the sense of what is to be a Jewish Christ believer. And that is why when he presents himself as a proud Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, he's not only telling about something about his biography, he's telling something more powerful about how the people really elected by God before, now, what is their place in this new broadening community of Christ believers. And then the things are very complex. My argument is that the Conversos, none of them almost were, or a few of them were biblical scholars in our modern sense of the term. They underscored these problems. They underscored these in their own effort to try to recreate this genetic moment of Christianity in order to enable those new Christians of Jewish origin to be full-fledged, perceived as full-fledged Christians in their own communities. It's a kind of paradox.
Right.
But the paradox, I believe, begins with Paul, not with them. They're echoing and, of course, just multiplicating this paradox.
Right. And a lot of the early Conversos, I guess, kind of deal with this tension a lot. Like, let's say I was reading about Luis de Carvajal the Younger, who wrote Des Vida and other memoirs, so to speak. And he definitely deals with the dialectic a lot. You have anything you want to say about the Converso experience in a nutshell?
Well, the Converso experience is heterogeneous. But I will give you exactly the example of Luis Carvajal el Mozo. the people I dealt with the article were people who define themselves as fervent Catholics, all of them. They just wanted to be respected as fervent Catholics of Jewish origin. The case of Luis Carvajal El Mozo, and I just, we have to remember that he was burned alive at the stake by the Mexican Inquisition, I believe in 1596, more or less. He was a Judaizer. But not only a Judaizer, but what the Inquisitor called a dogmatista Judaizer, a master Judaizer. That is, it was, on the one hand, the opposite of the cases I studied, because Luis Carvajal El Mozo, he tried to be Jewish in his own ways and with the tools he had at that time, that is in Mexico, without almost any possibility to get to have access to rabbinic knowledge, without the possibility to fulfill a Jewish life due to the inquisitorial persecution, and he was baptized, he was Christian. However, when you look at his writings and at his interrogations, the way he constructed his Judaism is in many ways a kind of counter-Christianity, or I will say even a way of being Jew and counter-Paulinian at the same time. Right. That is not all his knowledge, but a lot of it he took from Christian and from Catholic books and teachings. He even was a student in a Jewish school, if I remember well, at Medina del Campo in Spain. That is, his formation was Catholic,
right?
Was Christian,
right?
And then his ways of becoming a Jew or a crypto-Jew was framed upon Christian values and contents and sensibilities. And then his way of dying at the stake as a martyr in Mexico, was not the usual way of the majority of the Converso Judaizers sentenced to death by the Inquisition at those times. At those times, the majority of them will finally collaborate with the Holy Office and will be died, suffocated before, as repentant Christians. The point is the fact that Luis de Carvajal died burned alive. This he took for sure from the Maccabees, but especially, I will claim, from the Christian idea or ideal of the martyr. And this is what I meant when in his case I am talking in terms of counterculture. His way of being Jew was to be a counter-Catholic, a counter-Christian, a counter-Paulinian.
Right.
But of course, Luis de Carvajal El Mozo stands in one part of the rainbow of what is to be a Converso, whereas the other people I dealt in the article, like Pablo de Santa Maria or let's say El Relator, or they stand in the other part. Even though they have something in common, and what they are something in common is a kind of consciousness that they are coming from the God's chosen people. But even if each of them interpret it in a very different way.
Right. it's interesting how he kind of found Judaism through Christian texts, Carvajal at least.
Yes,
And
yes.
When
In part.
right.
Yes.
And so his Judaism, like I think Ronnie Perella says, was in a way more Christian than Jewish, ironically, because it was fashioned obviously by the crucible of Christianity. Well, Judaism itself, obviously, Christian and Judaism. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, personally, I am a little bit reluctant to speak about Jewish or Christian in very clear terms, because what is to be Jew and what is to be a Christian? What is the core? What is the core of the religion? Is the core of the religion, for instance, the Jewish religion, the fulfilling of the law,
right,
but the rest is open, or is the Judaism or Christianity entails also meta-theological issues like idiosyncrasies and cultures and way of living? And this is a problem that, for instance, if we are speaking of Christians, for instance, at that moment, the Jesuits became aware and more aware in the missions. What is to endorse Christianity? Do you need to be closet, to be dressed as an European to be Christian, to be a Christian, or it is enough to believe in the Trinity, for instance? And I will say that in the same case here. And moreover, permit me, I am an historian, but in the way of each of us frames his own identities today, including the religious identity, has a lot to do with the way we integrate things, ideas, as language into our lore. I will say for instance, my own Jewish identity is a clearly Westernized identity, but it is not less Jewish. You know, there is, for instance, two ways of interpreting the concept of syncretism. The broader way of syncretism is when you find two elements coming from two different religions. But in this sense, as van der Leeuw and other phenomenologists said before, years before, it is possible that all of us, we are in a way or in another syncretic.
Right.
But in a more strict sense, if by syncretism you mean a person or a group who believes and endorses two elements or more coming from two religions which are antithetic between them, in their own systems. That is to say, the Messiah didn't come, and to say at the same time the Messiah is Jesus and he came. This is syncretism. And in this more narrow sense of syncretism, I will say that Luis de Carvajal el Mozo was perfectly Jewish, because even though the way he built his Judaism was built also with Christian elements, he was very careful not to include things like the Trinity, or like the fact that of the question of the Messiah, or the need to fulfill the law, the Mosaic law, in order to attain salvation. And he was very careful not to include other ideas, antinomianism, the sacraments, or the Trinity within his life. And then, yes, Luis de Carvajal was a Judaizer,